Hey guys, it's Jeremy from Guy Issues, and in a different video I talked about the reasons on why it's so hard to be assertive, but in this video I'm going to go over specifically how you can learn how to be assertive. So before I dive into the video itself, let me give you an outline of the major sections I'm going to go over. I'm going to go over three main fixes on how to be assertive. The first fix is setting your values and boundaries, and I'm going to dive into more detail regarding that. The second fix is deal with the fear that hijacks you from being assertive. This kind of deals with why when you want to speak up for yourself and when you know you should, you find out that you just can't. Like literally you can't open your mouth, or you try to say something but nothing comes out. So this section specifically addresses how to deal with that fear that's hijacking you from actually saying what you want to say and asserting yourself. And it's going to dive into mindset fixes as well as targeting your body to feel confident, to feel like, hey, I feel free to express myself. And the last fix number 3 for how to be assertive is how to practice being assertive. And I know it sounds very cliche, sounds very broad, but I promise you there's more material behind it. And I'll tell you specifically step-by-step, statements you can use to be assertive and what you can say to be assertive, as well as making sure you make assertiveness a habit and how to practice it as a habit so that it becomes a natural extension of who you are instead of, let's say, trying it, failing, and then just saying, fuck it, I'm never going to be assertive. So let's go ahead and dive into fix number 1 on how to be assertive. The very first thing before you learn how to be assertive is you have to set your values and boundaries. Your values, what you value from yourself and from other people, will kind of dictate how you assess their behavior. To use a shipping analogy or a ship analogy, they're like the rudder that kind of directs you where you want to go in terms of what do I accept from other people, how do I assess their behavior, and is it acceptable? So values and boundaries are kind of like your North Star. They let you look at things through a filter of is this acceptable or not. And without values and boundaries, you won't really know, like, should I say something or is it really not a bad thing they said? Because quite honestly, it doesn't matter to me personally. So examples of values and boundaries that I have personally, and this is something I came up with really quickly, is I do respect other people if they deserve it, and I also expect the same. I'm empathetic to other people, but I don't try to caretake their behavior. I'm present in the moment. I act in spite of my fear. And there's other examples I put in the post that I don't quite remember off the top of my head as I'm doing this video. But you can definitely refer to the post to kind of see my blog post, which I'll link down in the description of this video, to kind of show other boundaries and values I have to judge other people's behaviors from. And these give me a great deal of security and sense of self, because it's like, hey, this is what I know about myself, what I'm willing to tolerate and not tolerate. And it's very simple. Like once I have the guidelines laid out, as someone crosses it, then I know I have to, or I want to actually say something about it. So that's why it's so important to have your values and boundaries, because without it, you won't be able to really tell if you should say something. You're going to continually say in a sense and state of confusion until you have them. So I get what you're kind of thinking. Okay, values and boundaries, no shit. I read about it. I read different posts on how to be assertive and how you have to have boundaries to kind of keep yourself intact, which is true, by the way. But it's also so fucking hard to determine, is it really a boundary? Am I being too sensitive? Am I actually not being sensitive enough and I'm just letting people walk over me? And that's a great question, because I fucking went through that shit. Let me tell you how many times I would just go into a situation, feel like I was being disrespected, and just like fucking be angry, right? Like it's like, should I say something? I should be standing up for myself, but I don't know if I'm being too sensitive. If I'm too sensitive and say something, people will laugh at me. So I'm sure some of you guys have gone through that scenario, because it's something I went through so many times. I would literally go back home and journal the situations. And that's something I actually recommend you do, because it takes self-reflection to know. Like I get it. Like you don't want to be too reactionary to the point people are just like, dude, you're on edge, you're putting us on edge. But you don't also want to let people walk over you because it's a fucking terrible feeling. So you actually start to not really trust yourself. So let me tell you how I kind of dealt with it. Before I dive into that, actually, it's not something before I dive into it, but it's more just like, the thing is, as you build up your self-esteem and you start to really work on yourself, you'll become more and more attuned to your values and boundaries. It's something that I hate to say, it's a process. As you work on yourself and make yourself feel better, you'll start to be like, oh, maybe I was taking it too seriously. And they didn't mean that. It's just the fact that I was always fearful of everything, that I interpreted too much. So as you work on your self-esteem, it will naturally happen. But in the meantime, what I recommend you doing is, when these situations arise where you're really not sure if you crossed the boundary, go back home after the event ends, write down what happened, and here's my step-by-step framework. List out the events that made you feel bad. Like, what was said to you? What did people do? How did they look at you? Whatever it may be. Every detail you can remember about the experience. Then ask yourself, why do I feel bad about it? Is it because of your interpretation? If so, what is your interpretation? Like, for example, if my friend teased my hair, right? I might be like, it made me feel like I wasn't good looking and not attractive and no one would want me, right? But then, based on that interpretation, you have to ask yourself, is it true? Is your interpretation of what you thought happened true? And a lot of times you'll find like, shit, I'm actually just taking it too seriously. And other times you'll find like, and this is the next step, if you find that it continues to bother you, then maybe you're running up against a boundary. Because if it's something where you try to rationalize away, you look into, you think about yourself, you're working on your self-esteem, over time, if it keeps bothering you, then you should say something about it, because chances are it's crossing your boundary. For the items that you realize, like, I'm being too serious about, you have to learn how to just drop and accept, hey, you know what? It didn't feel good, but that's because I looked at it the wrong way. But for stuff that actually, you're like, dude, it's been like a few weeks, it's happened a few times, and it's still continuing to bother me, even though other stuff is no longer bothering me. That's stuff where I say, just fucking go for it. Like, go and just say something. You don't need to be an asshole when you're being assertive. You don't need to be like, you don't need to say like, shut the fuck up, or like, stop doing that, I fucking hate you. You can just be like, hey man, that wasn't cool. But the whole point is, when in doubt, act. If you waited for a while, it's continuing to bother you, it feels fucking bad, you have to realize you gotta take care of yourself, right? This is not about pleasing other people. This is about restoring a sense of self for yourself, where you feel like my voice matters, and if something bothers me, I can speak up. So when in doubt, just act. It's better, I've found, and it's a cliche saying, but it is true. It is better to ask for forgiveness than it is to ask for permission. Because if you're always looking to ask for permission to be assertive, you'll never be assertive, and you'll never learn what it's like to be assertive and how it feels like. And quite honestly, part of being assertive is sometimes potentially overstepping the boundaries. And I'm just looking at my biceps to see if it looks big in this video, but it's really true. It's about overstepping your boundaries, not your boundaries actually, other people's boundaries, or just like acting a little bit too harsh sometimes, to the point that you're just like, oh shit, why do you say that? And then you're like, okay, I was being too serious, or I took it too far, my bad. Because sometimes you got to really kick the boundaries out to see like, hey, maybe I took it too far, or actually I'm still not standing up for myself enough. So that's how you can kind of like set your values and boundaries. Like, yeah, you can use a list I gave you. You can read around and kind of spend some quiet time figuring out, which I'll recommend is all and good. But it's only through experience and trying things and figuring out what really continues to bother you, and then actually taking action, that you can kind of assess, hey, I was taking it too seriously, or shit, I didn't do enough. I need to stand up for myself more. So that's fix number one on how to be assertive. You got to set your values and boundaries and kind of figure out what they are before you really, really know if you're setting the right boundaries. And yes, it is a catch-22. Sometimes you have to set a boundary to really figure out, is it a boundary that I should keep or not? Everything I tell you the fix, they're very interconnected. Very rarely is it like you do this, then you do this, then you do this, and they don't affect each other. They all affect each other. And that's how life goes. It's very cyclical sometimes. So for fix number two, in terms of learning how to be assertive, it's deal with the fear that hijacks you from being assertive. And this, I think, is probably the biggest point for a lot of you and for me on why it was so hard to be assertive. It's because, you know, you're in that situation and you rehearse it in your mind. You're like, I'm going to say something this time. This is the time I stand up for myself. I'm fucking sick of being stepped on. And then the time comes, and guess what? You end up not saying anything. You end up fumbling over your words. You end up looking down, not being able to look your perpetrator in the eye. And then you just leave because you're so fucking ashamed of yourself. You're angry at yourself for not saying anything, for letting that person walk over you again. And you feel rage, helplessness, shame, because it just feels like you're not good enough to actually exist and just assert yourself and say, hey, stop doing that. It's making me feel uncomfortable. And I get it. I've been there. And as I mentioned in my other video on why it's so hard to be assertive is because you know what's going on? Fear is so deeply embedded in your mind and body. It's not about just saying, oh, you won't lose anything by being assertive. And if they're not there and they decide to not be your friend or your girlfriend, whatever it may be, they weren't worth it, which is true, by the way, because the thing is, it's not just in your mind, it's also in your body. And you have to fix both your mind and body and heal both your mind and body to be able to get to a point where like, oh shit, that doesn't feel good. I'm going to say something, and I can actually say something to say, hey, stop it. So, how do we deal with each part? Well, let's start with the mind. Quite often, again, it's so hard to be assertive because we have low self-esteem. We don't feel like we matter. And the thing is, your behaviors, how you act, will follow your mindsets. If you fix your mindsets, your behavior naturally will follow as an extension. And this is kind of related to also healing your body, but let me just focus on the mind. Quite often, we have the wrong mindsets that perpetuate a cycle of learned helplessness. So here are the mindsets that I want to go into and how you can implement them to really start instilling in you a sense of you matter, you can do this, and this is what you need to believe in order to stand up for yourself when push comes to shove. So mindset number one, I recommend implementing, and I'll go into how to implement it later, is you have to be okay with loss. And the example I put before in my post and also the other video is I was scared of not having other friends. I was scared of not having another girlfriend. I accepted whatever came to me because I thought this is as good as it gets. Nothing ever is going to come close to this. And because I associated so much value to that, and I didn't believe in myself, I became terrified of loss, right? I felt like if I lost it, I would lose it forever, and life would never be as good. And here's what it took for me to get over my fear of loss. And this is kind of how you can get over your fear of loss. Is personally, I just hit a threshold. I was fucking tired of being walked over. Like the idea, I remember just sitting and saying, the idea of living life in such a way that I'm in a constant state of anxiety, I'm in a constant state of being walked over. Fuck it, I don't give a shit. I'm gonna say something, and they leave, so be it, because I will feel better that they left and they're away instead of staying in my current state. So the pain of my current situation became greater than the perceived pain I would go through if I asserted myself. And there's other points I put in the post on how I got over my fear of loss, and you know, I'm only going to cover a few things because I don't quite remember it off the top of my head. But another thing was just I decided that, you know, it's not about the results. I'm so scared of the loss, but deep down, what I've learned matters to me is living true to my values and boundaries, and I'm not living in congruence with these values and boundaries, and it's hurting me because it's not
Powering
even
off.
It's my speaker. It's not even about just like the results. It's just the fact that I know deep down within myself that I have these values and that I can live according to them, but I'm just not. And the idea of not living according to those values is like, wow, that's not good. And I'd rather just live to my values and let the chips fall where they may lie, because quite honestly, I realize I can't control life. part of the reason why I was so scared of life and losing is because I was trying to control it. I wanted to hold on to what I perceived as the good things. I didn't think I deserved more. And this ties to the other reason why it was hard to let go of things I should have is I had low self-esteem. But as my self-esteem raised, I'm like, hey, there are better things out there in life. And sometimes you have to go through this, become a stronger version of yourself, and let go of it so you can move on to better things. And quite honestly, there's a point I wasn't lying to myself. Growing up, I was religious, but one thing I've really had for a sense of myself is a sense of destiny and faith that no matter what happens, no matter the pain, everything will eventually become all right, and I'll become stronger because of it. And I trust in the universe, God, whatever it may be, that life will get better if I do something about it. And that's what kind of took me over my fear of loss. So that was mindset number one to implement, is be okay with losing. Because quite honestly, you have to sometimes lose things to move on to something better. And that's how life works. It's like a caterpillar, right? Becoming a butterfly. It has to shed itself before it moves on to better things. So for mindset number two to implement, it's treat everyone as your friend. I know this sounds like it sounds like very new agey, woo woo, whatever. But let me explain it. The reason why people shit on you is quite honestly because you give off that vibe. Fear is so deeply in your mindset that you become very reactive. And this is understandable. I'm not saying like just stop doing that, because as we know, that doesn't work. But the thing is, our mindset starts to go to a place where we start thinking about how people will shit on us, how people will step on us, and we become very reactive. We become just scanning the environment for dangers, and we always think something is going to step on us just in the next moment. And this behavior is really bad because when you go to a gathering, what happens when you meet people? You feel very tense. You think they're going to step on you. And what does this do? It puts you in a fearful state of mind. And what that does is, for people that actually take advantage of other people, it lets them know that you're prey. So the idea of treating everyone as your friend, it goes into shifting your mindset. You stop thinking, how are people going to shit on me? And you start thinking, I'm going to treat everyone as my friend. Like, this is what I'm going to do. When I go to somewhere, I go to an event, I'm going to try to get to know them. I'm going to try to have fun. And what that does is it shifts your mindset. You're not looking and scanning to see how people will shit on you, which would then put you in a reactive state of mind. But you start thinking, how can I have fun? How can I get to know someone? And the thing is, when you're trying to get to know people and have fun, and you start really focusing on other people, people like that. And it actually gives you this sense of not reactivity now, but more so, hey, this person's out to have fun, and he's interested in who I am, and I'm not, and he's not someone that's scared of being shit on. So when your mindset shifts and your focus shifts, naturally that will change your body language and how you feel about yourself. And you'll start to get experiences where you see evidence that when you think positively, and I don't just mean think positively and things will happen, but when you start to look at lens of how can I get to know people and have fun, you start to see people responding positively to you, and that's going to start to implement a new mindset of the world is not as scary of a place as you thought it was. So that's the mindset number two. Mindset number three is don't caretake other people. This is a really short and sweet point, and this really is targeted for the people that, let's say, are used to taking care of other people's feelings, are trying to always people please, trying to make other people feel good. The reality is you got to put yourself first. You matter. Other people are other people. I'm not saying be an asshole, but you got to put your needs first. And the way people feel about what you do, if you did something wrong, you should apologize. But other than that, it's the other person's responsibility for how they feel. You are not responsible for them. You're only responsible for you. Okay, so those are kind of the mindsets I recommend implementing. As we know, a lot of times you can learn the mindsets, but it's not very easy to actually believe it. And this is why I'm diving into how to actually implement these mindsets, because shit, I know it's hard. I know how hard it is to be like, oh yeah, just believe in yourself, stand up for yourself. And then when push comes to shove, I'm in the same fucking place where I can't stand up for myself. At the very core, and this is something you probably notice as a theme, self-esteem is what makes you feel like you matter enough to say something. And self-esteem, raising your self-esteem, this is a whole topic in and of itself. But as you naturally increase your self-esteem, you feel like you matter enough, you're more likely to speak up, and it's going to naturally implement the mindsets that I told before about being okay with loss, treating everyone as your friend, basically not viewing the world through a lens of fear, and not trying to caretake other people because you believe I can take care of myself and I'm not responsible for taking care of other people. But at the very core of self-esteem, and not a quick fix, but more of a simplistic way about doing it is, if you want to feel better about yourself, you have to learn how to disconnect from the disempowering thoughts. And what I mean by disconnecting from the disempowering thoughts is there's a lot of shit, like this goes really deep into how the mind works. But the point being is you probably have years of bad mental programming going through your head, such as you're not good enough, you're not strong enough, what you say or do doesn't matter, right? And the thing is, the mind's a little bit of an asshole. It's a good servant, but it's not a good master. Like, it's going to repeat programming. So that's why for people that grow up being assertive and they learn how to be assertive, it becomes a virtuous cycle because they see people respect them, they believe people respect them, and for them it's easy to be assertive. And that habit repeats for like X number of years. So when push comes to shove, it's very easy for them, right? But for us, we have years of negative inertia to work against. You have years of programming in your mind that goes like, you're a piece of shit. You don't matter. You only matter as much as what you do, right? And the thing is, if you had years of that repeating in your mind, that's a lot of inertia to go up against, right? So the first thing to do is fucking disconnect from it. And if I can offer anything, like self-esteem is about believing in your worth and not identifying with your thoughts, because you're not your fucking thoughts, right? I mean, this is something that took me a while to figure out, but you are not your thoughts. I think of random shit all the time, like fighting off ninjas, but I'm not a person that fights off ninjas. And I know it's a silly point, but the point being is, then why do we always identify with the negative thoughts and not the positive thoughts or the silly thoughts, right? The point is we equate these negative thoughts with our identity because we also had experiences that back it up. That's why we associate it. But the reality is, even though we have those experiences, those thoughts, they're not us. They don't define us. They don't need to hold us hostage anymore. So the key is to just disconnect from the thoughts. And when I say disconnect, I'm not saying don't try to think of negative thoughts, because we know that doesn't work. It actually makes it more likely you'll think of something negative. What it means is when thoughts come in, you're able to process it and be like, oh, that's interesting. That's not me. So there's a few techniques I listed out in the post, and I'm going to go over into how to really disconnect from these negative thoughts. Technique number one is noting. Noting is just simply noticing the thought. For example, if a thought comes in and I'm like, fuck my roommate, if he ever says this again, this is what I'm going to do. And noting is just like, oh, I noticed I had these thoughts about me being angry toward my roommate. I noticed that. And the reason why this disconnects it is because you start looking at it from a lens, right? Like when it's right next to your head, like, fuck the roommate, blah, 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 you identify with it. But when you notice it, it comes out here. It's like, oh, I notice I'm thinking of this. And you make space. So you're like, I don't need to identify with that thought. The second technique for disconnecting from disempowering thoughts is labeling. It's the same thing as noting, except now you put a label on it. So once you notice it, you're like, oh, that's anger. That's fear. That's shame. And again, you make space where you're like, I'm thinking of these things. I felt that way, but now I make space and I don't have to identify with it. The third technique I've used before and what helped for disconnecting from negative thoughts or just not letting it run my life is imagining the thought, when I see the thought in my mind and catch it, I imagine it like on a projector. And I imagine the projector being black and white quality. And what that does actually is when you put it as black and white quality, it kind of mutes the emotion behind it, right? Because if it's like vibrant and color, then the emotions become stronger. And then I start imagining the script just playing through the movie. And then I start imagining the size of the movie screen projector just going smaller, 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 smaller to the point that it doesn't even matter. And the same thing, it's another way to just, if you're more visual, it just kind of like puts the thought away and disconnects it from you. Last but not least, the last technique in terms of how to disconnect from disempowering thoughts is watching yourself as a third party. And it's almost like sometimes I imagine myself, when I catch myself thinking something negative, I imagine it in my head and I imagine myself watching myself having the thought in my head. So imagine like the thoughts right here. And then I imagine myself just observing myself having the thought in my head. So it's almost like I know that's part of my programming, but that's not me. And this is something that I want to say, like, please keep in mind, this stuff takes practice. You have years of bad programming. So it's not something where it's a quick fix and then you just do it for like 2 weeks and all of a sudden you're cured and you're always going to be confident. This is something that I recommend. Practice it daily. Anytime a thought comes in that you don't like and you realize it's taking you down the wrong path, learn how to use one of these techniques and just choose one, or if you want to try different ones, try to find at least one that kind of works for you and just continue practicing it. And over time, when your thoughts come in, when it becomes a practice actually and a habit, you're gonna be like, oh, interesting. I notice I am still thinking that thought and I know why I'm thinking it, but now I have the choice to disconnect from it. And that's one way to really realize and go to the core sense of your sense of self. Because once you get rid of all the shit, you're like, hey, fundamentally, I can feel insecure at times. There's shitty things that come in, but I know at the very core, I'm worth it. So the next part of fixing and dealing with the fear that hijacks you from being assertive, I just kind of went over the mindsets and how to implement the mindsets, but also manifests in your body. So I want to target how to deal with the rigidity in your body. Because at the very core, it's like, think about the times you want to be assertive, but you just couldn't assert yourself. How do you feel? Like your throat probably felt dry, your mouth felt dry, it felt constricted. You felt very rigid, probably a lot of tension in your shoulders, in your arms. You felt like you want to just get something off your chest, right? Literally, there's pressure there. But when you wanted to say something, like you just stood there in fear, like everything felt frozen. And that's kind of how fear manifests. Like there's science behind it, but fear kind of manifests as rigidity and tension in your body. And the key is not only do you want to implement these mindsets, but the thing about integrating mindsets is you have to also feel it, right? It's not something where there's a difference between understanding and conceptually and believing it and really feeling it. And I'm sure that's where a lot of the advice on how to be assertive fails, because it tells you what you should think and how you should think, but it doesn't make you feel assertive. And it doesn't give you that sense of empowerment. I can stand up for myself when the time comes. So this is how you target your body. You have to just target the symptoms of rigidity and tension. You have to find a way to open up your body so that you feel relaxed and more open. So when time comes, you feel like you can respond, right? Because when you feel a lot of tension, it basically feels like you're shelled up and you're unable to respond. And there's a lot of different physical practices. I won't go into each one too deeply because they're their own studies and there's plenty of resources out there on it. But one example of how you can deal with the fear and rigidity in your body is really by doing yoga. Yoga is a really good practice, and I know some of you might be like, I'm not into that, but trust me, if you do yoga constantly, you'll find that you sleep better. If you have sleep issues, you'll find that you just feel so much more relaxed and limber. And what that helps you do actually is, there's a lot of studies actually out there on how doing yoga will improve your sense of self, your sense of anxiety. It lowers anxiety. And when you have lower anxiety and lower fear, that means you're more apt and likely to respond when someone crosses your boundaries. So yoga is a good thing to really look into. Another practice to target your body is deep breathing. This is a really simple exercise. Just take a deep breath and exhale. And do this for a count of 10. Just a deep breath and a slow exhale. Do it for a count of 10. Because naturally, when you force your breathing to slow down and for it to be more full, it will naturally relax your body. So you'll notice if you do it for even less than a count of 10, you'll start to feel a difference. If you're truly... And it really helps. Like for me, I try to do it at least every hour. And I find that a lot of times I'm so tense and I didn't even realize it until I consciously breathe in and breathe out. So make it a practice to breathe deeply at least once every hour if you can. Last but not least, and it's a very cliche, but it's really true, exercise. Studies have shown that if you stay on a workout program for at least 10 weeks, it improves your sense of self, it lowers stress, it improves your self-esteem or sense of confidence, whatever. And actually, it just relaxes you. And again, fear is rigidity and tension in the body. When you relax yourself, you get rid of that fear and it makes you more likely to believe in the mindsets that I mentioned and be able to act when it comes time to be assertive. So that's kind of it in the sense of how to deal with the fear that hijacks you from being assertive. So the last fix in terms, or last step rather, in terms of how to be assertive is practice how to be assertive. And I know it sounds cliche, but there's a few things I want to go over into how to practice. I want to go over, learn what to practice, like how you can practice being assertive. Because quite often it's like, well, I know I should stand up for myself, but where do I start, right? So that's that point. The second point is setting the right success metrics in terms of how to be assertive. And the third point is starting small. So in terms of learning what to practice, this is applicable for guys or anyone where you're like, actually, I know I should be assertive. I kind of get stand up for yourself, but what do I actually say? So this will address what to say when you need to make an assertive statement, but you're not exactly sure what to say. So the way I view it is the assertive statements tend to come into three formats. One is a humorous response. The second one is a question, and the third one is a question and a statement. And I'll go into each one. So for humorous response, this tends to be used when a person kind of crosses your boundaries, but it's not like a really big one, but it's just making you slightly uncomfortable. Like if someone kept poking me, I'd be like, oh, goddamn, you're really touchy today, right? Keep your hands to yourself. That's an example of using like a light and or humorous response to kind of diffuse the tension and not be like too severe, like don't fucking touch me. But it just kind of lets the person know jokingly like, hey, you know, you're crossing the boundaries, just don't do it. And again, it's used for very low grade situations, kind of like minor transgressions, however you want to call it. The second format of a assertive response is a question. This is usually used when, you know, you have to assert yourself and you have to be a little bit more blunt about it. And it's just asking the person to stop. It's like, hey, can you stop poking me? Thanks. You can say thanks at the end to kind of just lower how blunt it is. But the point is you just ask them to stop the offending behavior. And again, you use this when someone's kind of doing something that is really crossing your boundary. The last format is a question and a statement. And this is usually used for like a huge boundary transgression or where you feel like you need to make a bigger point of, hey, you keep doing this shit. I asked you to stop, but you won't stop, right? So it's taking the question like, hey, can you stop poking me? And you add a statement. And usually the statement is how you feel about it to kind of explain why you want them to stop. So an example would be like, hey, can you stop poking me? I feel very violated and that you're going to my personal space when you keep doing that. And I ask you to stop and you don't stop. So obviously, again, it's used for more of a severe transgression. And one thing I do want to mention is don't kind of go into like blaming the other person and saying like, you're so inconsiderate, you're so disrespectful. It's just really ask the question. The question is, can you please stop doing the offending behavior? And the statement is about how you feel. Focus on how you feel. You'll notice in my statement I said, I feel this because you do this. It's not like you're an asshole, you do this deliberately. Because when you start accusing the other person, it puts them on the defensive and makes them more unlikely to kind of actually listen to your request of your boundary and not crossing it. So those are kind of the three formats in which you can use to practice how to be assertive. The next thing about practicing how to be assertive goes into setting the right success metrics. When I started out trying to be assertive, I would beat myself up when I would try to be assertive, but it wouldn't go the way I wanted. Like, I would try to assert myself to my girlfriend, my then girlfriend, and she wouldn't respond positively. So then I would be like, fuck, I wasn't assertive. Then I would beat myself up more. I don't want you to do this. Because the thing is, you can't control how other people will respond to you, but you can control yourself. And I realized for me, what stopped me from practicing it as much as I wanted to initially was just the fact that I would put so much pressure on myself. I would beat myself up over what people said or did in my response of being assertive. And I didn't realize the progress I was making. So what I want to say is, in terms of setting the right success metrics, consider it a success if you just tried to be assertive. If you just opened your mouth and said something, even if it went poorly or you didn't even say what you wanted, consider that a success. If you tried something, just consider that a success. If you thought about how to be more assertive, consider that a success. And the reason why I want to say, like, set these metrics on things you can control is to keep you motivated, because these are things you can control. And if you consider success as sticking to those things you can control, you're more likely to practice how to be assertive instead of just beating yourself up if things don't go your way. Last but not least, in terms of practicing how to be assertive, is start small. For people that have struggled for years in terms of how to be assertive, it's not easy to go from doormat to instantly asserting yourself on big issues, and that's fine. What I found worked for me is always ramping up to things. Like, you always hear stories about how people, let's say, sold their company for 100 billion, blah blah blah, and just very spectacular, sensational stories. And it can also tie to like how I instantly in 1 week became assertive. The reality is that doesn't work for most people. You have to build up to it. You have to progressively ramp up to bigger situations. So what I would say is start small. You don't have to start confronting everybody. You don't have to like confront your boss. Start by, let's say, if you're at a restaurant and someone messes up your order, you just let them know and ask them to get you the correct order. Because when you actually take small baby steps and see the results of it, it actually starts building a virtuous cycle of, hey, I can actually be assertive. Actually, what I say, people may listen to and will respect my needs. And when you have that baseline, right, you can start building on that baseline, and you can be more and more assertive to bigger situations, to the point that eventually it becomes a natural part of yourself. So definitely don't try to do it all at once. Just try to start small and just focus on the next step ahead of you. So there you guys have it. Those are my tips on how to be assertive and how to actually learn how to be assertive and really believe you can be assertive and actually act assertively. If you guys have any questions, comments, or commentary, feel free to leave it in the comments below. I welcome all feedback. I want to make any video I make for you guys as good as possible. So whatever you guys have, go ahead and shoot it over to me. Until next time.